On behalf of all members of the ARU, I would like to wish Artemis and her Compass research team a great success with the implementation of the project, and to all of you in this room and on Zoom, a stimulating and enjoyable participation in the seminar series and its discussion sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thanasi, for the wonderful introduction and the very kind words. I would also like to address a very warm welcome to everyone attending in person and to all those following us online. We are very pleased to welcome you to the first lecture in the seminar series organized in the frame of the ERC Standing Grant Compass project. Compass is the acronym for Commercial Patterns Across the Sea, the interdisciplinary study of maritime transport containers from Cyprus, and the elucidation of Mediterranean connectivity during the late Bronze and early Iron Age, as mentioned by Thanasis earlier. Before I introduce our speaker, please allow me to say just a few words about this research program that was launched at the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus in June 2021. Compass aims to undertake the comprehensive and interdisciplinary study of commercial jars, specifically the so-called Canaanite, Egyptian, and transport stirrup jars that were imported to Cyprus from the Levant, Egypt, and the Aegean during the late second and the early first millennium BC. On the basis of contextual macroscopic studies and with the contribution of state-of-the-art interdisciplinary approaches, the project investigates the provenance, chronological association, and the contents of the imported commercial jars, as well as their volumetric standardization, morphofunctional qualities, and the marking strategies entailed in the vessel's production, distribution, and consumption. The program also investigates the vessel's secondary use and depositional practices. So, acknowledging these ceramic proxies as principal contributors to the study of interregional exchanges, our research ultimately anticipates shedding light on the transformative character of ancient seaborne commerce and providing substantial insights on intercultural connectivity in the Mediterranean. The implementation of these multifaceted tasks of Compass relies on the integration of the knowledge and expertise of specialized researchers who are or will be employed at the Archaeological Research Unit in the course of the following years. We therefore considered that it would be a wonderful opportunity to invite the new members of our group and our research collaborators to present their previous, ongoing, and future research in relation to the interrelated topics raised by the project. And this is how this seminar series came about. Please note that the seminars are not organized on a regular basis, but we will make sure to announce each one well ahead of time, and also keeping with the hybrid format to enable our colleagues outside Cyprus to also follow. For today's seminar, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Cassandra Donnelly, who has recently joined Compass as a postdoctoral specialist in charge of the study of marked vessels. Cassie comes to us fresh from completing her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin with the dissertation Science of Writing and Trade in the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean under her supervisor Tom Palaima along with Nicole Hirschfeld. At Texas, Cassie studied at the program of Ancient Scripts and Prehistory, where she learned Linear B and Cypro-Minoan and also studied Ugaritic and other Semitic languages. Since graduating, she's under contract to author a book on Cypro-Minoan with Cambridge University Press's Element series and a chapter on Cypro-Minoan for the Cambridge Companion to the Bronze Age Aegean scripts. She's currently editing an interdisciplinary volume on extra-scribal writing in the ancient Near East for Transnational London's Life and Society in the Ancient Near East series. She's also a collaborator in charge of publishing Cypro-Minoan bookmarks from Maroni Bounes in the frame of Cambi, from Gideon Bambula for the French mission at Gideon, and for the East Attica Bears project. Today, she will talk to us about writing, marking and trade in late Bronze Age Cyprus, and we all very much look forward to learning more about this intriguing topic. So thank you all, and now I will give the floor to Cassie.
Thanks so much, Artemis. I am so excited to be part of the project, the awesome team you've assembled, and to everyone at the University of Cyprus. I'm really excited to be with you for the next 2 years. So thank you, and thanks for this welcome. So, poised as middlemen between the ancient Near East and the Aegean, writers of Cypro-Minoan, the undeciphered late Bronze Age script of Cyprus, borrowed and transformed writing practices from their neighbors and invented new ones. Bits and pieces of the Cypro-Minoan script are spread far and wide throughout the Mediterranean, but we find fewer of the longer administrative texts characteristic of the neighboring Scrabble-based writing traditions. Instead, we find many short, non-administrative texts, and many texts on mercantile objects such as vessels, anchors, and ingots, indicating the importance of trade activity in the transmission of the new script. Thanks, Art. New discoveries and new approaches to Cypro-Minoan highlight the mercantile settings of the script's use and affirm the many non-administrative dimensions. But Cypro-Minoan inscriptions are so unlike the texts from neighboring script traditions that scholars of Cypro-Minoan continue to have problems categorizing them. The script remains poorly understood and is still undeciphered. Reconstructing the circumstances of the script's adaptation from Crete to Cyprus continues to prove difficult. There is minimal archaeological and textual evidence suggestive of contact between Crete and Cyprus during the period of script transmission from Linear A, sometime in the 16th and 15th centuries. Nevertheless, the similarities in the shapes of signs shared by the two scripts indicate the transfer of knowledge from the writers of Linear A to the writers of Cypro-Minoan. The circumstances which brought Crete to Cyprus or Cyprus to Crete have yet to be pieced together and may never be. There are only 4 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions dated to the earliest 2 centuries of the script, an insufficient number from which to reconstruct the nature of script transfer. Even if we had more texts, the process of script transfer is rarely transparent. Scripts can be invented by a single individual or group, or develop slowly over hundreds of years in a process scholars of writing called script diffusion. More often than not, script transfer combines a unique invention followed by a long period of script reform. My recent classification of a late 2nd city, early 3rd city inscription on a local vessel handle from Milos, carrying a Cypro-Minoan inscription, would make it the earliest Cypro-Minoan found outside of Cyprus, and the first Cypro-Minoan inscription from a setting where we know that Linear A was written. Cypro-Minoan vessel inscriptions, like the Melos one, are a common Cypro-Minoan writing medium, and often associated with trade because they appear outside of Cyprus and on types of vessels that were frequently traded overseas. The archaeological evidence for Cycladic Cypriot contact in the 16th and 15th centuries, however, is limited. It may well be the case that overseas trade was conducted between Cyprus and the Cyclades in perishable materials, or durable ones that don't survive in abundance in the archaeological record like metals. But whatever the case, it is likely that our understanding of the script's earliest uses will remain obscured. The LC2C, roughly the 13th century, sees a relative explosion of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, continuing to and past the volatile so-called collapse period, when the scripts linked to centralized administrative centers such as linear V, Hittite cuneiform, and Ugaritic, go out of use along with their administrative centers. Cypro-Minoan is found at 5 sites outside of Cyprus during this period, 2 of which, Tiryns on the Greek mainland and Ugarit on the Syro-Palestinian coast, produced locally made texts. The presence of Cypro-Minoan outside of Cyprus and the discoveries of Cypro-Minoan texts among the wreckage from 2 different shipwrecks, one the Geladonia shipwreck off the Anatolian coast, and the other the Hishule Carmel shipwreck off the Syro-Palestinian coast near modern-day Haifa, firmly puts the script in mercantile context. At Ugarit, a number of Cypro-Minoan texts were found in the homes of individuals involved in a mix of royal and private, for lack of a better term, trade. The last period of the script's use is equally as obscure as its first. At issue are the small number of post-Bronze Age inscriptions, so there's 6 of them, 5 of which are from Paphos, and the opaque relationship of the Bronze Age to the Iron Age scripts. There is no doubt that many of the sign shapes used in the later Cypro-Slavic script derived from Cypro-Minoan, but the shapes of the signs evolved and were put to write at least 2 languages, one Cypro-Arcadian Greek and the other a language possibly related to the one used to record with the Bronze Age script. But where the Bronze Age script ends and the Iron Age ones begin is not well understood. A recent discovery, a bronze bowl from a firmly Iron Age context at Paphos, is either an heirloom or the longest, latest Cypro-Minoan inscription. The inscription is especially interesting because it contains a sign sequence also seen on 2 late Bronze Age bowls. Whether or not the Paphos bowl is an heirloom, it testifies to the material presence of the late Bronze Age script into the Iron Age. Only a small portion of Cypro-Minoan texts from any period can be considered administrative in the sense that the term is applied to contemporary writing from the Aegean and the Near East. Writing is labeled administrative when the text material features are heavily standardized and when its contents refer to the administration of goods and or people. Even in cases of undeciphered scripts, administrative texts can usually be identified because of their standardized formatting, heavy use of numerals and or logograms, and repeated sign sequences. Cypro-Minoan texts, by contrast, are highly varied in their writing media, their sign sequences, and formatting, among other features. After some debate, the consensus is that the script contains no logograms, and only 10 of the 240 or so inscriptions have numerals. Moreover, Cypro-Minoan is usually not written on purpose-made writing surfaces like tablets, as behooves administrative context, but on objects that were made for other purposes, like vessels, cylinders, and tools. And we've added our Zebu here. He's a unicom. He's very cute. Many of these objects were the types of objects that were frequently traded overseas in the 13th and 12th centuries. Cypro-Minoan is the only script in the region whose writers regularly wrote on mercantile objects, and it's tempting to link the survival of the script during the upheavals of the 13th and 12th centuries to its uses in trade contexts. The mercantile context of many Cypro-Minoan inscriptions does not, and I'll emphasize that, does not mean that the texts record mercantile information. To the contrary, the texts are too few and too varied in their sign sequences, likely to record information pertaining either to the type of object bearing the text, its contents, provenance, or its intended destination. The same sets of signs also appear on different types of mercantile objects, indicating that the text likely refer to the mercantile context in general, not to the objects themselves. Nicole Hirschfeld has hypothesized, tentatively, that the texts from mercantile context refer to the traders themselves or their trade activities. I define an object as coming from a mercantile context in cases where A, an inscription is on the type of object that was widely traded overseas. I think that's easily acceptable. And B, perhaps less accessible, acceptable in cases where we find several inscriptions on the same type of object outside of Cyprus at different places. This definition includes some objects that were not necessarily widely traded, like cylinder seals or local jugs, but which seem to have traveled widely along trade or were reproduced overseas. The extent and significance of the inscribed material for the history of writing on Cyprus is a matter of debate hinging on the definition of an inscription. In addition to the full-length inscriptions on objects from mercantile contexts, there are also many single-sign texts on the same types of objects that used to be, but no longer are, categorized as Cypro-Minoan inscriptions. The first 100 years of the script's discovery, from about the 1890s through until 2007, a text was considered to be Cypro-Minoan if it contained a single script sign. In 2007, Jean-Pierre Olivier published a list or corpus of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions called Ho Chi Minh, which excluded the single sign texts because they were too numerous to publish within a reasonable time period. To paraphrase him, he defined, for his purposes, an inscription as any two-sign text bearing script signs of the same approximate height and on the same approximate plane. Sylvia Ferrara, who published her archaeological corpus of Cypro-Minoan in 2013, followed Olivier's definition of an inscription, increasing the number of inscriptions to 244. Ferrara likewise excluded single-sign text from her corpus, but unlike Olivier, did so because she believed that there is insufficient grounds for determining whether a single-sign text records a phonetic sign, so whether it's meant to record the sound of a letter or sign in an alphabet or syllabary, or if it only records a non-phonetic mark. One way to sidestep the difficulties posed by the single sign text is to reframe the question. Instead of asking whether individual texts are writing stricto sensu, we can ask whether the single sign texts were produced in the same literate environments as the multi-sign texts. This reframing focuses on the social practice of writing and gives us insight into the role of writers and writing in overseas trade without miring us in the usually unanswerable question of whether a single sign from an undeciphered script written on an isolated object is a phony. The text on objects from mercantile contexts seem to exist on a spectrum, going from inscriptions, so multi-sign texts, to single-sign text with script signs, and to single-sign text without script signs, which are indisputably not writing. The single-sign text that contains script signs, some probably record phonemes and others probably do not. And while it's often impossible to assess whether a specific single-sign text is using its sign as a phoneme, due to meager contextual information, in my dissertation, I argue that the single sign texts on vessels in general were produced in the same literate settings as the multi-sign texts. Today, I would expand that argument from the vessels to include other objects, such as the copper tools and cylinder seals. Sorry, we have gone in the wrong direction. And, oh, there it is. Okay, perfect, thanks. I make this assessment by assigning equal weight to the content of the text as to their material features, which I take as indicators of the setting in which a text was produced. I argue that the single sign texts were produced in the same literate environment as the multi-sign texts in cases where the single sign texts have the same formatting as the multi-sign texts, were made with the same methods, appear on the same types of objects, were found in the same general context, And in the cases of the single sign text with script signs, whether they have the same repertoire of sign variants, aka different shapes of the sign, as in the multi-sign text. And lastly, if the same repertoire of signs are used as abbreviations in the multi-sign text as on the single sign text. According to these metrics, on the whole, I conclude that the text from mercantile contexts, whether full-length inscriptions or single sign texts, belong to the same system of meaning production. As mentioned above, Nicole Hirschfeld has tentatively hypothesized that they refer to the handlers of vessels, a hypothesis that fits the diverse number of signs and marks on the vessels and the decentralized nature of much of the trade conducted in late Bronze Age Cyprus. Recognizing that the single sign texts from mercantile contexts are generally made in illiterate environments significantly expands the numerical and geographical extent of Cypro-Minoan writing and its writers. I want to stress, however, that this claim is a general one that flattens a quite complex data set. The single sign texts are varied and probably do not reflect a single marking system, but several. How many marking systems we have on different types of vessels and how they relate to one another and to the script are open questions. As I will discuss in more depth shortly, my work here at the ARU will be to try and elucidate and distinguish between the different marking systems on one specific vessel type, the Canaanite jar. But before continuing on to the Canaanite jars, I want to flesh out a bit where we stand in our knowledge of Cypro-Minoan, since much has changed in only the past 10 years and much remains to be understood. As recently as 2011, Brent Davis wrote that the study of Cypro-Minoan was in its infancy. Despite the many advances in the intervening 11 years, I believe that the assessment is still generally correct. We still cannot say with any certainty how far the script traveled outside of Cyprus, how many inscriptions we have, how many signs we have in the signery, or whether we have one script or many. And of course, the script remains undeciphered. Since 2011, new inscriptions have been identified at 4 additional sites outside of Cyprus. The count of inscriptions can be raised by as many as 40. The number of signs in the signery is in flux, and Mason's subdivision of the script into 3 subscripts has fallen out of favor. One of the most volatile features of Cypro-Minoan is its signery, which has gone from having over 100 signs in Amelia Mason's signery from 1974 to as few as 66 in Miguel Valerio's 2016 dissertation. Traditionally, in the study of Aegean scripts, the method for developing an accurate signery is to assemble a list of words and through the word list identify patterns in the signs use. The small number of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions and their short length impedes efforts to observe patterns in a sign's use or to identify variants. And just to give a quick example here, we have our letter E. It looks like some of the fonts have gone missing. They were supposed to be more varied, but you can kind of use your imagination from our capital E to our lowercase e. We had some fancy other fonts there too, right? But how do you know which is a variant of the letter E and whether or not they're the same letters? Well, the more examples you have and the more patterns you can observe, the better off you are. And again, likewise, being able to recognize patterns of prefixes and suffixes and the like. So with Cypro-Minoan, we just don't have enough material really to be able to do any of that with any degree of reliability. A recent PhD by Martina Polig took a new approach to the script aided by 3D models of inscriptions, which she built from millimeter accurate laser scans of the original text. And she was able to capture about 65% of the corpus. Polig's new approach was to construct a signery based only on sign shape, using computer-aided technologies to compare sign variants from different inscriptions to one another, and from there to deduce rules according to which the different shapes for signs are constructed. Polig's signery results in an 88 sign signery that she regards not as the final word on the matter, but the best guess awaiting verification from more inscriptions. Against the backdrop of an unfixed signery is the issue of the script subdivision. Almost since the inception of Cypro-Minoan scholarship, the texts have been divided into subclasses. The most long-lasting of these subdivisions is Amelia Massan's subdivision of the script into CM1, CM2, and CM3. Masson subdivided the script based on perceived paleographical differences in certain groups of texts. She grouped together the inscriptions on tablets from Enconi, which she called CM2, based on the square and squat appearance of the paleography. She included as CM1 all of the other texts from Cyprus, whose paleography she characterized as more elongated and elaborate than that of the tablets. Lastly, she designated as CM3 select texts from Ugarit that she believed represented yet another paleographic style unique from the other two. Though Masson's primary grounds for establishing the subscript were paleographic, she also noticed what she believed were subsets of signs that were unique to the different subscripts. So CM1 had its own few signs, CM2, CM3, and so on, with a kind of core, let's say, of 50 signs that they all had in common. The weight of current scholarship is going against Amelia Masson's subdivision of the script. The critiques of the subdivision are along two separate but intersecting lines. One, criticism of the grounds of the subdivision, and two, criticisms of its usefulness, which argue that it's premature to subdivide a script that we still don't adequately understand. Palaima in 1989 was the first to critique Masson's subdivision on both counts. He showed that there was a wide degree of paleographical variation within the CM1 subscript and argued that the subdivision was therefore arbitrary and should be done away with until the script is better understood. Polig's 3D models substantiate Palima's observation concerning CM1's paleographic diversity. Polig herself, as you'll see here, does away with the subdivision in constructing her signery, as did Sylvia Ferrara in her corpus. Olivier preserves the threefold subdivision, but puts CM3 in quotation marks, since he did not think that it was a paleographically unified subscript. So he didn't really believe it. He just kept it for tradition's sake. Masson's claim that each subscript contains subsets of unique signs is also being challenged by new evidence from Martina Polig's 3D models, as well as new and/or rediscovered inscriptions. Several signs that Masson originally claimed only existed on the CM2 tablets have now been observed, both on inscriptions she would have classified as CM1 and CM3. The number of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions is also in flux. I count some 40 inscriptions that meet Ferrara and Olivier's definition, but are currently not published in either corpus. In the other direction, Steele and others have suggested that at least 7 inscriptions from Ferrara's corpus be removed. Among the 40 or so uncounted inscriptions that should be added, most are on vessels. Nicole Hirschfeld and I are currently assembling for publication all the vessel inscriptions that meet Ferrara's definition and Olivier's definition of an inscription. At the moment, we count around 125 vessel inscriptions, a number which will fluctuate up or down in the coming months, bringing up the number of published vessel inscriptions from the 75 published in Ferrara. The new count makes the vessel text the most numerous Cypro-Minoan vessel inscription type, reinforcing the mercantile dimensions of the script. Massimo Perna is producing a new corpus, which will include at least some of the new inscriptions that we have counted, but I know that he and I sometimes have disagreed over what counts as an inscription, as Nicole and I sometimes disagree. I'll provide just one example of a text to illustrate why there are disagreements over a definition that seems rather straightforward. This is a 3-sign text on a Canaanite jar that was excavated from Mycenae. I'm choosing this text as an example, in part because it has recently been argued that it's written in the Proto-Canaanite alphabet, more popularly known as the Phoenician alphabet, which is a misconception that I've since heard repeated and would like to nip in the bud. This might not be Cipro-Minoan, but it's definitely not alphabetic. I will fight about that. And the evaluation that the script has something in common with Cipro-Minoan is not just because of the shape of the signs, but the material features of the inscriptions, formatting, the type of vessel that it appears on, and so on. The text was first published over 100 years ago, at a time when no Cipro-Minoan had been found on the Greek mainland. The handle meets the definition of an inscription employed by Farrar and Olivier. It has 3 signs of roughly the same size, roughly the same plane. The 3 signs are not attested in linear A or linear B, nor are they obviously in the Proto-Canaanite alphabet. We do not have any after firing candle inscriptions from linear A context, from linear B context, or from Phoenician alphabetic context, but we do have many similar texts from Cipro-Minoan contexts, including several in Canaanite jars. The similarity of the inscription sign shapes and material features suggests an affinity with Cipro-Minoan, but only one of the 3 signs has an exact match with any sign in the Cipro-Minoan signery. The other 2 signs are attested in texts that are currently not counted as Cipro-Minoan inscriptions, begging the question whether or not it's our definition of an inscription that needs reworking in the context of Cipro-Minoan. Sign 1 only appears in one other text, a single sign text, which is not regarded as containing a script sign. And sign number 3 appears in 2 multi-sign texts that are currently not considered Cipro-Minoan texts because sign number 3 was not regarded as a sign in the signery. So what are we to make of this situation? Is this an inscription that combines script and non-script signs together? Are we missing a sign from the signery that hasn't been noticed for all this time? What do we do with the other 2 inscriptions that are the comparanda? The combination of script and non-script signs on the Mycenae text is an extreme example that illustrates some of the problems we still face in the study of Cipro-Minoan. The line between inscription and single sign text and between writing and marking is much more fluid than we would like it to be for constructing a signery or for a potential decipherment. But it's thanks to this fluidity that we have the greatest portion of graphic material, much of which is on objects from mercantile contexts. If the study of Cipro-Minoan is in its infancy, as David suggested, then the study of the single sign text is probably prenatal. Nicole Hirschfeld has established solid groundwork for the single sign vessel text and their study, but the corpus is simply too unwieldy for anyone, however methodical. There are over 2,000 texts on vessels from or related to Cyprus that are roughly contemporary to the Bronze Age script. The vessel texts are on a variety of different vessel types from over 40 sites on Cyprus and abroad. The texts have yet to be assembled into a single database. Most often, they are published as part of site-specific excavation reports, which at least ensures their publication, but is a barrier to understanding the phenomenon of vessel marks more broadly. It is more than likely that the material reflects several marking systems with differing relationships to the script, some of which have none. Hirschfeld classifies the pot marks according to the type, provenance of vessels, method of text production, placement of the text in archaeological context. As of now, there are no discernible patterns suggesting a link between the type of sign and the type of vessel, the vessel's contents, or its geographical location, whether of production or fine context. Hirschfeld has identified macro patterns in the correlation between jar type, marking method, and mark placement. Within each broad class of material she identified, there are sometimes several marking systems in use, some of which are interrelated with the marks on other types of vessels and others which are not. And so I won't go through this list exhaustively. We've included red lustrous ware up here, even though it was not produced in Cyprus, but they're distinctive for being before firing inscriptions. The majority of the vessel texts that we have from Cyprus are probably after firing. And this is both painted texts, which are primarily on Mycenaean vessels, and in size. I say probably because we just don't have any good method for verifying whether the paint was applied after firing or whether an incision was made after firing. There's some possibility that they could be made leather hard. I've spoken to some of the potters in Kornos who assure me that you would never incise on a leather hard vessel for fear of breaking it, so especially on the handle. But I've also heard from Gloria London that maybe it'd be fine. So there are really differing opinions. So if anyone has a method for figuring that out. As a postdoctoral researcher with Artemis Georgiou's ERC-funded Compass project, I will study the marks on the maritime transport containers in an attempt to elucidate the number of different marking systems on them and, where possible, their meaning. In my dissertation, I included one type of maritime transport container in my study, the Canaanite jar, and concluded that the text on the jars contain at least one marking system that exists on a continuum with the multi-sign inscriptions. The number of multi-sign texts on Canaanite jars, however, is very small, suggesting that these texts with a relationship to the scripts account for only a small portion of the whole. Many contain both simple and complex non-script signs placed on various locations of the vessel. One of the aims of my portion of the Compass project is to identify whether the different types of marks and mark placement correlate to different types of vessels or different marking systems. If possible, it would also be great to correlate the physical features of the marks, such as the size and shape of the implement used to make them, to certain types of jars or certain types of marks. The overall goal of the Compass project is to study the Levantine, Egyptian, and Aegean MTCs from the Cypriot context of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods as a means to elucidate the transformative character of ancient commerce and provide substantial insights into intercultural connectivity in the Mediterranean. The different researchers in the project will focus on different attributes of the vessels in order to construct a holistic study. The studied attributes, as Artemis told us earlier, include vessel morphology, origin, contents, chronology, capacity, manufacture and technology, marking strategies, and depositional practices. The entirety of the collected data will be assembled into a database, which has been created with the help of Irini Katsuri. The constructed database will allow for the easy comparison between the different vessel features, including the marks. My job in the project is to catalog and classify the different vessel marks in the database and to compare them to the data on jar type, volumetrics, etc., collected by the other members. It is our hope that new patterns and even different marking systems can thus be identified. I will be particularly concerned with evaluating whether the marks encode information pertaining to their mercantile context, and not only are just the handlers of the vessels, as Hirschfeld has proposed for the marks in general. A secondary concern will be to discern how and whether the marks relate with other regional marking and or writing systems. Marked MTCs from sites on Cyprus, in the Aegean, and in the shipwrecks comprise some 400 vessels. Of these, a not insignificant portion will be available for me to autopsy in person, most of them vessels found on Cyprus. My main role in the project is to catalog and classify marks so that the features of the marks can be compared to the other features of the vessel. The type of mark will be classified along with its method of production, material features such as the size and thickness of lines, direction of incision, and placement on the vessel. Secondary or non-graphic marks on the vessels will also be recorded when possible. So you can see here that the two marks in the center also have thumbprints, right? And in general, thumbprints have not been collected as an attribute, so it's pretty hard to say what portion of the marked vessels have secondary marks, but it's at least an interesting feature. My first order of business is to classify and inventory the marks. The goal will be to assign every mark an inventory number, you can see here on the bottom of the slide, that can be appended to its compass inventory number. So NCOMI, the site where it was found, CJ, the type of vessel, and then the number. And my job is to try and come up with a system for categorizing the mark numbers. Among the challenges in constructing the inventory of marks is determining whether similar signs should be considered the same sign. So essentially the same problem that confronts us when establishing a signery, and figuring out whether signs of the same shape but placed on different parts of the vessel should be categorized as the different or the same mark. So see here the two slashes on our examples on the side. Is this one mark? These separate marks? Is the fact that they're positioned differently mean that they should be cataloged differently? More so is the one on the extreme right 2 lines, 3 lines, 4? And these are the types of questions I have to consider. The normal way that signs and signeries are ordered in Aegean script studies is to begin the signery with signs based on a simple vertical line, and then to count upwards from there as more complexity is added on, and then move to signs with curved bases and so on. The practice of incising slashes into the sides of the vessel surfaces, however, resists easy classification. Given the wide variety of sign and mark shapes that seem to be derived from the same basic shapes, I'm actively looking for other ways to categorize the marks. Should anyone have any ideas, suggestions would be welcome. Another significant challenge in typologizing the marks is determining how to characterize the relationship of a sign to the script. So for example, we have our simple plus sign on the left. It's a very common sign on single sign vessel text, but also in the multi-sign vessel text. And it's also a script sign. The solution to the ambiguity posed by signs that may or may not be script signs is to record in the database whether a sign is a potential script sign and which one, but to keep the mark inventory system independent from the numbering system used for the signs, especially since we have no fixed signery. The database, therefore, will number the marks separately, but provide drop-down lists indicating which script a sign belongs to and which number in the signery it belongs to, accounting for the possibility that marks belong to signs from other script traditions, such as a few examples we have of signs marked with potential Ugaritic signs. In that way, the hope is that identifying and cross-referencing between mark and script signs will not be too difficult. After classifying the marks, the next order of business will be to examine as many MTC jar marks in person as possible. The goal of autopsy is to record the material features of the incisions not apparent in photographs, such as the width and depth of incision line, tool marks, and other indicators of the mark inscription method. In that way, it'll be possible to observe if types of vessels that were incised with the same type of tool or in the same technique cluster in any meaningful way, indicative of common production. I will also record how different texts were formatted on the vessels to deduce if there are any patterns that correlate with vessel content, size, or the marks themselves, indicating some standardized patterns in mark applications that have so far eluded us. Cyprus was unique in the late Bronze Age Mediterranean with respect to its regular use of writing and marking practices in the context of overseas trade. It is also unique in what appears to be a diversity of marking practices in simultaneous use. I argue that the writing and marking systems are broadly related and believe that with more study, we will be able to distinguish which marking system or systems were made in the same literate context as the inscriptions in which were not. The Compass Project provides us with a real opportunity to identify for the first time with any degree of specificity the various marking practices related to one specific vessel type, and how those marking practices related to their distribution and trade. Given our continued struggles to understand some basic features of Cypro-Minoan, I'm skeptical that the script will be deciphered. Though I understand that Silvia Ferraro's Scribo project is hot on the script's trail. The pessimism I feel about the script's decipherment is not, to be clear, a pessimism towards the study of Cypro-Minoan and its writers. On that point, I'm quite optimistic that with projects like Artemis's that treat the text as part and parcel of the objects on which they appear, which give equal importance to the content of the text as their material features, that we can make great progress in understanding the intersection of writing, marking, and trade in late Bronze Age Cyprus. Thank y'all.
Okay, thank you so much, Cassie. Well, first of all, for giving us a up-to-date overview of what's happening in Cypro-Minoan studies, and secondly, for giving voice to these objects that I agree with you need to be studied. So can I open the floor to questions? Yes, Bert.
I agree, and second Artemis's comment that it was very helpful to have your, maybe I should take this off.
Yeah, and I might repeat it
views on the current state of Cypro-Minoan studies, which reminded me that sometime in the 1980s in the RDAC, I published an article with a student of mine critical of Masson's tripartite division, although for the life of me, I cannot now remember what the criticism was. So you might want to have a look at that just for the record. Frequently in your talk, you mentioned you're going to look at signs in mercantile context, quote unquote. What is a mercantile context? How would you define a mercantile context?
Yeah, that's a great question and something I will continue to struggle with. But for the purposes of the script and today's talk, and I think going forward, it's one of two things. So one, the type of object that's frequently traded. And then I wanted to say that I think that we should include cases where we have a certain inscribed object type in multiple sites outside of Cyprus. I know that's pretty vague and there's no guarantee that those sites are necessarily mercantile context. So what are we doing with the context where we have Cypriot material culture on Tyrants, right? It's sort of facile to automatically call something like that a trade context.
So it's an, as you might say, an internal description. You're using the Cypro-Minoan signs to define a mercantile context. What I want to know is, what do you think is a mercantile? What might a mercantile context be?
Gotcha. The one place that I've really been looking to and thinking about mercantile context is to Ugarit, which is basically, at least we have some documentation and description, and I'm really interested in, at the end of the 13th century, these highly mobile individuals who are associated with administrative centers, but seem to be traveling throughout the Eastern Mediterranean pretty widely. So some of these people we have documented in the Ugaritic text. A favorite of mine is this official Taprami, who we have documented in Anatolian hieroglyphs at the center of Hattusha. We have him going to Carchemish, we have him going to Ugarit, and we see him recorded in multiple different scripts in multiple different places. And it seems like there's a good deal of mobility among people who, yeah.
I don't want to take up all the time, but you still haven't focused in on what I want you to say. So I'm going to ask you once again with examples.
Yeah.
Is it a house? Is it a burial? Is it a mortuary set? I mean, one example of some kind of mercantile context, a real specific context.
Yeah, I guess maybe the term context was the wrong to use, in the sense that I think it's the objects that are indicative of a general overseas exchange. And if we look at the types of objects and make an overall assessment, then from there we can make an inference. But I don't think it's about a particular archaeological context. I think for the most part, unless it's a shipwreck, and even then, you know, it's hard to say this is where trade was happening. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Cassie. I think Jenny Webb had the question.
Thank you, Cassie. There is, as I'm sure you know, a long history of pot marking on Cyprus prior to the Late Bronze Age, starting at least from the early Bronze Age. And that was a marking system, if we can call it a system, that was in use across the island without there being any contemporary script and without there being any connection with mercantile activities. And as far as I can see, a lot of the signs that you showed us occur on the simple crosses, the multiple horizontal lines or oblique lines or vertical lines, and other more complex ones. So I'm just wondering if you think it would be useful to look at the earlier, look at the several thousand years of pot marking on Cyprus prior to.
Yeah, for sure. It's not something I did for my dissertation, but there's also a continuity. There's the kind of dot markings that you see, which look like the gouges into the surfaces of handles. And it's really site dependent, but at a place like Corian, for instance, you have a lot of those into the late Bronze Age where there seems to be some continuity. So, you know, when I'm saying that there's many different marking systems in simultaneous use, or the potential for interaction between multiple different marking systems, this is what I mean. You know, like we can make a general picture, and when you compare the script signs in use in the pot marks on the single sign text, you can make a strong argument, I think, that the people who made them knew how to write, and that's because they draw the signs the same way, they format them, etc. But I think there really is something to be said about continuity, and I think there is some continuity, and it's really hard to say whether or not that is site specific. So like, why do you see a lot of them in Korean? I don't know. Is there something going on there? So it's very much something that needs to be figured out. I'm not sure if the Canaanite jars are the place to do it, but it's very much a sort of avenue of further study, for sure.
Right. And I believe Gloria London has raised her arm. So if her hand, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk differentiating the various marks. I described some of the marks that were made by traditional potters in Cyprus in the wet clay in the book I wrote, Wine Jars and Jar Makers. And that clay is comparable to the clay of the Canaanite storage jars. It's so coarse that there it is possible to make marks in the wet clay. If you have a finer ware, I can understand people saying they would hesitate to put pressure on it. But also, the jars take such a long time to dry, the clay takes such a long time, that you have lots of opportunity, days or weeks even, while the clay is drying, to make a mark in the wet clay. And then when you look at the traditional pitaria of Cyprus, you can see those jar makers did not hesitate to make marks in the wet clay. But thank you for differentiating everything. I learned a lot.
You're welcome, and thanks for that comment. Yeah, it's very much a live question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Nicole, good morning. I guess it is for you. Would you like to? Yeah, there you go. Hi.
Yes. Good morning. Good morning. Cassie, every time I listen to you, I learn stuff. And it's great to see someone taking on this big project, because looking at just the marks on amphoras, much less all the marks, raises all sorts of, there's still so many basic questions. And this isn't a critique. This is just to underline some of the big problems. Lena raised one with her question in the chat. Why differentiating between single marks and inscriptions? What do you mean by inscription? I think that's really important to be clear about, because you mentioned Geladonia as Cypriminoan, but is it single question? It's very important to identify, to be clear about those terms. Before firing, after firing, as you've said, is such an important differentiation to make. Visibility, and I definitely take Bernie's point on mercantile. I threw out the idea of these marks being associated with merchants, basically because I couldn't figure out anything else that they would be, but that's not a very strong argument.
Yeah.
Some things that a couple things that have always bothered me is, we know some jars are reused. What do you do with a marked jar when it's reused? I mean, do you scratch out the mark? We would just find that a broken jar in the archaeological context. We have some really interesting ones. There's an amphora from Zawiyat Al-Rahim that has two different marks and different ductus on the handle. So that's really interesting. When does a mark go out of use? Is it a single term? And the other point is, it's so important to start with the fabric. And so I'm glad that Compass is doing that, is going to give those ideas. And I'm thinking of a Canaanite jar handle that Asaf Yasur Landau found at Afek. And that's on local clay, a sign that he would identify as Cypriminoan. And that really throws into turmoil into interesting places where these marks are made from when. So I'm really excited that you're taking this on. And it's always hard to figure out, do you start with having all the questions answered, or do you just start with the assemblage and say, this is what I have, and this is what there is, and these are the kinds of questions that are raised. And so I think that starting with the amphoras and just looking at the different marking systems. And I would also mention one more. I think it's from Hala Sultan Teke, where there's an amphora handle with a scarab impressed into it. Yet another marking.
Cartouche, yeah.
Yeah, the cartouche, exactly.
Yeah, the cartouche, sorry. And then there's the marking systems that are in the sides of the handles. So there's many, many marking systems. And I'll say one final thing. When I wrote my dissertation, there were hardly any marks recognized or published in Israel or the Levant. And now in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, they're finding more marking. So it's not a simple process that you're starting on. So I commend you for having the courage to do that.
Thanks, Nicole. And I mean, that's why the project is so important, is to be able to focus on a specific data set. I think that's the only way that we can move forward at all. I wanted to specify that the Geladonia inscription I'm referring to is the one on the tool that we identified. So, anything that was called an inscription tonight fits Ferrara and Olivier's definition. I might argue with that definition. I don't love it, and I don't think it fits Cypriminoan in the complexity of what we see, but for the purposes of communicating and for the purposes of trying to develop a signery, it's a functional definition. So in that context, and today, anything called an inscription fit that definition.
So is this in response to Lena's question? Why do you only include tin ingots with singles or multiple signs and not copper ingots?
Yeah, so why tin ingots and not copper ingots? That's a great question. The reason for excluding them in part was just I did not know how to talk about the complexity of the copper ingots in kind of a general presentation, but according to the MA by Kaiser, which I'm sure you know. There's multiple marking systems going on with the copper ingots, the full-size ones. There are ones that are impressed while the metal is warm or hot, maybe molded, that seem to have relationship to the Cypro-Minoan marking systems and to the script. And those ones, I think, you know, are similar and maybe even part of the same system of meaning that we see on the tools and the vessels. But there are no full-length inscriptions on the full-size copper ingots as far as I know, and as far as meets the definition. So there are a couple with 2 signs that were found in Sardinia, but those are not script signs. So we'd say those go outside of the strict definition. So that's why I bracketed them. The tin ingots, you know, I would say indisputably we have 4 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions from the Hisholais Carmel shipwreck of 2 script signs, same plane, same size. So
Great. Okay, and we have a question from Pippa Steele. She thanks you for the wonderful paper. So Pippa asks whether you think there is a range of types of literacy at play in the Cypro-Minoan script world. An obvious example could be that some individuals are semi-literate and might produce odd sign shapes, but there could be other processes at play. For example, perhaps people involved in trade who are literate in multiple writing systems. Could that perhaps affect the range of signs and sign shapes on offer? Yes.
yeah, for sure. And I think the way that I think about range of literacy is, you know, there's certain types of academic articles in fields unrelated to mine, like the medical field. When I try to read them, I can read the words, but I have no idea what the article's saying, you know? So areas of competence or literacy, and I think that's how I think of it. So if you look when I look at, to use the term Bernie hates, objects from mercantile context, meant to be very broad, there are features that these texts seem to have in common. So there's a lot of 1+1 inscription formatting where you have a sign, a word divider, and another sign. There seem to be sort of habits that are more common on those types of objects than others. We still see them on the texts that we have from other contexts, which I would say are like firmly domestic in the sense of not abroad. So yeah, there's sort of a spectrum of different types of Cypro-Minoan literacy, for sure, for sure.
Great, thank
Thanks,
you.
Pippa.
A question from Professor Maria Kovu.
Thank you. Cassie, wonderful. I know that in the context of Compass, you're working within a specific chronological horizon. But what about the time period when we see the marks continuing into the late Iron Age, and they are the same ones? We find them as late as the Cyproclassical era. Do you stop considering?
Yeah, I think that there are so many open questions with Cypro-Minoan, and if you want to learn about it, work with me, please. I'd be happy to help train you, because it's too much. One thing that Artemis Carnava and Massimo Perna did, which is really great, is they included the single sign vessel text in the Inscriptiones Graecae, right? Which means that at least those marks on vessels that we have in the Iron Age have been assembled into a corpus. They exist somewhere. One thing that Artemis Carnava has seen with those is that there seems to be kind of ligatures, so combination of 2 script signs to make a mark. That's something we don't really see, at least not noticeably. I mean, it could be the case, but that's been missed in the late Bronze Age. But for sure, I mean, there's a lot of continuity in the types of objects where inscriptions appear on, their formatting, etc., between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And, you know, part of when I say that a lot remains to be understood about the relationship between the 2 scripts is, when do you call one thing over and done with and the other thing something new? And to say that that happens when the script is used to write a new language is only correct depending on the type of question you're trying to answer, right? What are you trying to describe? And yeah, in terms of the material practices, there's a lot of continuity and a lot that remains to be understood. Yep.
I suppose if it's just a single mark on a handle, which looks quite like the ones you have bronze in. It doesn't have to be another language. It's not necessarily. It's
Not
just
necessarily.
The same practice continue.
Yeah, and not necessarily another script. And I know there's some changes. So I think in the Iron Age, we see a lot more bases being incised, which is something that we really only see in Kitia. So, you know, there's some separations you can make and some continuities, and they're interesting and they're worthy of study. For sure.
So you, with your own work, your PhD and your work with Nicole, you stop with the end of the bronze.
Yeah. But recognizing that that's an arbitrary division. Yeah.
Okay.
But, you know, it would require
Yes.
a new competency, you know?
Well, we have a tremendously growing corpus of science from Galapagos.
Yeah.
We have to deal with them sooner or later.
Yeah.
Some think that's an arbitrary division, others do not think it's such an arbitrary division, just to be clear.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, we have, I think, a comment, not so much a question from Anastasia Tsinkunaki. Thank you very much. We have a loom weight with incised sign in wet clay, which does not find an equivalent among the Cretan writing systems. And she provides the reference. I'll forward you the chat later on.
Yeah.
And
can I cover
sorry,
that?
yeah,
Is that
please,
okay?
please, yeah, perfect, yeah.
So does everyone know what Tsugunaki is referring to? It is the discovery at the site of Halu Korafi, a discoid loom weight, which has made before firing a single sign, which does not have an equivalent in linear A, but does have an equivalent in Cypromanoid. And this is really interesting, and for sure it's a linear A context, but the problem is, you know, when you have a single sign on a single object, how do you say that there's writing there, right? There's only a writing tradition when you have something that's sort of more developed, or at least you can only say that positively. So it's really interesting, you know, one possibility, and this has been proposed for Cypromanoan by Bombardieri and Yassing, is, you know, what's the relationship between the marking system and do any of the marks get integrated into the script, right? We tend to think of it as the other way around, but is that a possibility, right? So is maybe something like we see on the Halu Korafi loom weight, that type of thing, where it was a mark that then gets integrated into a writing system. It really does look like a Cypromanoan sign, but at the end of the day, it's comprised of 4 simple lines. So, you know, maybe it's just the type of geometric thing that people make and it's a coincidence. So, you know, unless there's a broader context, it's hard to say much, but it's certainly interesting and an awesome, awesome find, which I made my Facebook profile picture for like a year.
Okay, and there's a question from Kostas Konstantinou on the Cypromanoan marks on clay balls, which I know that you have worked on extensively. You can just provide it short.
Yeah, so the balls are around like 2 centimeters in diameter. They are inscribed when the clay is wet. We have some 92 of these, most of them inscribed. 88 of them are from Nkomi, 2 from Hala Sultan Teke, 2 from Kidian, and weirdly enough, 1 from Tirans. And the Tirans one is so disturbing because it contains a 3-sign sequence that we see on Cyprus. So it really needs to be taken quite seriously. The excavators believe it's made from local clay. You know, it hasn't been tested, but that's what their experience tells them. So it's a really, really interesting artifact that has, and I mean, it's a repeated sign sequence that's repeated at multiple different sites. So it has gotten around that sequence. It has. We don't know what they're for. Maybe the best guess could be sortition, but a real large range of uses has been proposed, and I don't think we're that much closer to figuring it out.
Any other questions? I see one from, yes, Ryan Kokov. If you would like to unmute, will be somewhere update. I'm not sure what this refers to. Do you understand? Do you want to Yes.
Yes, hello.
Hi. Do you want
will-
to ask your question?
Yes, I asked and in the comments if it will be updated somewhere, this lecture.
I don't,
Uploaded the lecture, you mean?
that's a question for you, I think, Artemis.
Yes, the lecture will be uploaded on YouTube and it will be available a few days afterwards, if that's the question.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Another question by Nicole.
Just a quick question, Sidris, I see you're out there and I know you've looked at the marks on amphoras. I don't mean to put you on the spot and you shared your work with us, but I haven't actually had a chance to look at it. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the talk today. And sorry to put you on the spot if you don't want to answer.
Sidris, can you
Hi.
hear us?
Yes. Hello,
Bonjour.
everyone. I don't know about all the artifacts Cassandra is studying, but concerning the Canoniger, the marking system is like a long tradition because we find mark amphora in Middle Bronze also, and there is a drastic change between both periods, between Bronze and Late Bronze, which might be very interesting to better understand. I think I don't have a lot of ideas about them because I didn't study them exactly. I just have a few observations about the changing between both periods, but I don't know why they were marked, if they were for the content, the provenance, as Cassandra said, we don't exactly know. But I think there is a lot of Canoniger are not just Minoan, Cypro-Minoan inscription, and there is something to look also in the Levant. And for example, the amphora from Mycenae, you show us, I don't remember if there were three signs, and you don't remember on the handle there were one amphora with 3 signs, and you say sign number 1, it was not Cypro-Minoan, but in Late and Middle Bronze we found this exact sign on 3 different amphorae, and it's the only time I see this marked 3 times on different amphora. And so maybe I can show you the one from Byblos and the marks. So maybe there is something already in the Bronze, Middle Bronze.
That's
to look
amazing.
for
Thanks,
this
Sidri.
sign.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're entirely correct to say that the Levant also needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Sidris.
Thank you.
So comment by Nicole, and I'm reading it out, and I think it's time for coffee afterwards, unless, well, everyone in the audience can ask Cassie all the questions they had about Cypro-Minoan over coffee and drinks. So I'll just read Nicole's comment, an interesting parallel to the Middle to Late Bronze Age change in marking systems at Gare, where marking systems change significantly in presence of Late Bronze Age, though they are not Late Bronze Age in themselves. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you all for joining us. We're having a coffee now. I hope you have a lovely evening as well, or morning. And we'll let you know of the new lectures in this new lecture series. Thank you all very much, and thanks to the audience.